Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a Senior Consultation Specialist with 𝗪𝗂𝗂𝗿. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. With me today is my usual co-host, 𝗪𝗁𝗂𝗂𝗿, my colleague and an Indigenous engagement and traditional knowledge specialist at 𝗪𝗂𝗿𝗄𝗁. Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. So, Jen, shall we get started?
Let's begin. Are you sitting comfortably?
Okay. I will run through first the topics we're going to cover today. There's a lot of information
hmm
today. Um, so let's get started here. We're going to talk about the objectives of these two field studies, the groundwater and surface water
Right?
field studies. We're going to talk about what will be studied when it comes to groundwater, and then the same when it comes to surface water. We're going to talk about the study areas for both groundwater and surface water. Then we're going to dive into the details of the field studies and then finish up with a discussion of potential mitigation methods, ways of reducing impacts or minimizing impacts or eliminating impacts. And then finally, talk about how you can get in contact with us. So with
Oh,
that,
good.
let's talk about the objectives of these studies. And Jen, you and I have talked before about the baseline studies, and the ultimate purpose of them is to identify and look at potential effects of the project on a specific elements of the environment. In this case, groundwater and surface water, and then
hmm
provide some recommendations, right? Some as to how to minimize these negative environmental, health, social, and economic effects that are tied to groundwater and surface water effects during the construction and the operational phases of the project.
Right. And
So,
it's
in
good
terms
that
of
we are
groundwater,
addressing these because these are questions we've received in the past during our open houses and other visits, is people wondering about water.
well, yeah, and as you know, Jen, water is pretty important, if not the most important consideration for community members, isn't it?
hmm It sure is.
And, yeah, and groundwater, which is also called quite often by community members spring water, depending on where you are. Um, we look at, in terms of what we're studying when it comes to groundwater, we look at both quantity and quality. So when
hmm
we talk about quantity, we're looking at changes to what you call the groundwater recharge and discharge areas. So groundwater recharge areas are areas where the groundwater, where surface water or water that comes, through rain and and just flowing over the land, where it can penetrate the ground and travel through, and then go through the cracks in the rock and then collect and be stored in typically in rock areas called aquifers. And so these recharge areas are characterized by having soils that are what you call permeable, and that means they things can go through them, water can go through them because the particle size, like the spaces between the particles are are big enough to allow the water to move through. So, for example, when you look at clay soils or silty soils, the particles are very small. Clay soils, in particular, almost it's very hard for water to travel through them. When although in contrast, when you look at gravel, something like gravel, the spaces between gravel different gravel particles are larger, and so those are typically associated with recharge areas because the water can flow through and get into the ground. We also look at changes in groundwater level season to season, and then
Mm-hmm.
look at groundwater flow and movement, so the direction of flow or the volume of flow, any changes that might be caused by the project. So when we're looking at groundwater quantity and impacts on groundwater quantity, we need to look at we need to understand the soil, including the peatland and muskeg areas. We need to understand
Yes.
the bedrock geology, so the rock that's underground. Um, we need to understand, the groundwater levels and where these recharge areas are, and how significant these recharge areas are. Um, we also, in terms of this, want to look at the potential zones of influence that the project might have on groundwater quantity or flow or movement as well. When it comes to quality of groundwater, we what we're interested in that case is taking samples essentially and looking at the biological, chemical, and physical properties of groundwater, because we need to know the way they how the water is made up of chemically and
Mm-hmm.
physically, like the characteristics of the water now, in order to see if anything has changed later on, right? And we also need that
Right.
as a basis for predicting, right? For predicting any impacts that the project might have. So,
Which
um,
is not unlike, we talked about this before, getting your blood work done, going to the doctor and getting all
yes,
your blood work and knowing what all of those results are for your chemistry, and knowing where your sugars are at, knowing where your minerals are at, if you're deficient in vitamin D or not.
yeah,
All
no,
of
it's
those,
it's a great analogy, Jen. It's a great, but you need to know that information, right? You need to understand the way you are, and then understand, okay, something's out of whack, right? If something's showing up as high or whatever, but you can't, until you have somebody to compare to,
mhm,
you don't know the exact situation, right? You can't say that impacts of, that there have been impacts
changed,
made.
right.
Changed, things have changed, yes. So we also want to look at sensitive groundwater features, where these are relative to the project, such as drinking water wells, where there are springs, for example, where community
Mhm,
members get spring water. Um, these areas, are usually well known to community members, and they visit them quite often on a regular basis. And then understanding where the vulnerable aquifers, where those areas where water can flow into the ground, through cracks in the rock, and then be held there as well too. We need to understand where those vulnerable ones, understand where they are relative to the project, to see if the project would have any impact on them as well. Now, when we're talking about surface water, um, again, we're looking at quantity and quality. So when we're talking about quantity, when it comes to surface water, we're getting into the realm of what you call hydrology, which is surface water, the study of surface water. So we're looking at potential changes to the flow of streams, of water levels in general, um, erosion and sedimentation processes at water crossings. Um, because of course, when you have higher water levels, typically you get, you know, um, more flooded areas, and this causes erosion, and then those soil particles that are lost then end up in the form of sediment at the bottom of water bodies and water courses, and that can affect water clarity and water habitat, or aquatic habitat in general as well too. So um, we're also looking at impacts of the project on drainage as well too, because some projects could, if they're not designed properly, affect drainage patterns in a negative
Mhm.
way that might increase erosion in other areas, right? There's examples of that having happened and on projects before. Um, so what we do is we look at the number and type of water body crossings that would be um, affected by the project. Look at changes to stream flow. Look at water levels by modeling. So doing desktop work to predict the behavior of water under different situations or scenarios. And this is, Jen, where things like climate change come into play, right? Where um, we're looking at
Definitely has
because
an
climate
effect.
change, yeah, because climate change has resulted. I don't think this can be denied in extreme events happening in a more often, and
Mhm.
so this all has to be taken into consideration. And we'll talk a little bit later on, but especially when doing the modeling to identify, what size of culvert or what size of bridge to use. These things have to be taken into consideration to sort of account for this, to ensure that these structures will last a long time. And
Mhm.
and just try and understand what changes to there might be to drainage patterns and to the land in general, um, in terms of possible erosion and sedimentation in certain areas as well too. So that's kind of what's looked at when it comes to surface water quantity. Um, in terms of surface water quality, it's very similar to with groundwater, right? Just like you were talking about, Jen, with blood testing, it's the same thing with the water quality. So typically, what we will do as part of this work is take water samples where the crossings might be, so we can understand what the water quality is like, what the
Mhm.
chemical composition, what the physical characteristics, what the biological characteristics are of the water, where the road would cross the water body or water crossing. So, um, and then we're looking when we do that. What we'll look for example, is look at possible increases in the concentration of what you call suspended solids, because that might indicate increased erosion upstream, right? Because maybe flows are higher, and so there's more soil loss, and so that soil gets into the water, and it's suspended in water, so that pushes up the concentration of suspended solids, and can affect aquatic habitat, right? So we're looking for things like that. We're looking for changes in the chemical composition of the water during and post construction. And these could happen due to things like uh, discharges, maybe fuel spills, like accidents associated with construction and road operations. Now, just like we do with some of the other subject areas, we also look at study areas. Each thing that we study has a study area, and there's two types. There's the temporal study area or boundary. So temporal means time, and so typically we use a construction phase that could range anywhere from 3 to 10 years, and we look at all activities associated with it, with building the road and the associated and what you call ancillary or other infrastructure like the gravel pits and the access roads and lay down areas as well. And then there's the operations phase, which we typically consider to be the lifespan of the road, which is arbitrarily chosen at 75 years. So these are the activities associated with the operations and maintenance of the road. So those are the two sort of
Mhm.
time window boundaries, I guess, that you can describe them, that we use.
Yeah, those are good amounts
When
of
it comes,
time.
they are, yeah. And so that's what we use for groundwater and surface water. And then in terms of the actual physical study areas, so like the spatial areas, like the footprints, or the study areas that we use on the land and water, we have three different ones. We have the project footprint, which is basically what's underneath everything that's built for the project, both temporary and permanent. And so that would be the right of way and any other construction and operation areas. So that could include pits and quarries, access roads to those pits and quarries, storage and laydown areas, all that all that other kind of infrastructure beyond just the 2-lane roadway. We also have then a local study area, and the local study area for groundwater is defined as 1 kilometer from the project footprint. And then in the case of the what we call the regional study area, it's actually the same boundary as the local study area, and that's because for this particular project, groundwater impacts are expected to be minimal, so there isn't a need to expand to a very large regional study area because any impacts would be localized. Let's take a look now at the surface water study area. So you have the local study area, and then you have the regional study area. And the surface water study areas are based on what you call watersheds. So watersheds basically, I'm sure people have heard this term before, but what they are is drainage areas or catchment areas. So like the land areas that within which water travels and drains to a particular location, to a particular point. So the water flows over the land by gravity, looking for the always looking for the lowest possible location, and then it ends up in a particular point. So you select a point, and you can identify what is the area over which the water drains to that point. So for the
Mm-hmm.
local study area, so there's different levels of watersheds. There's primary, which are very big ones, big drainage areas. So primary watersheds would be, for example, the 𝗪𝗏 River watershed, which is a pretty big river and has the watershed covers a huge area. And then below there you have secondary and then tertiary and then quaternary, which is like the sort of the fourth level of watershed. So there's this hierarchy, right, from biggest to smallest in terms of drainage areas. And then you have a regional study area, and the regional study area looks at things from a larger catchment, so like a tertiary, what you call a tertiary watershed scale. So that's how the surface water study areas are defined. It's a little bit different from
Mm-hmm.
the groundwater ones. Yeah,
Bigger, a
because
little bit bigger, and
it's
there's
exactly because the impacts are, you're talking about you're talking about the surface, right? So it's a little bit bigger areas than the groundwater ones.
and really more than the right of way that we were talking about at the
Yes.
previous.
Yes. Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
And so now, why don't we dive in now to the groundwater field study? Because we do a couple of different activities for this, and so we have to install groundwater wells, or what's essentially what you call a piezometer, which is a tube
Piezometer.
that's piezometer. It's a tube that's inserted into the ground, down to the groundwater, and that helps us understand how groundwater levels change.
Mm-hmm.
So these will be installed and have been installed over the project area. We also take samples of groundwater as well. Um, and we do this at different times of year, in the spring and the summer and the fall, to understand how the water levels change season to season. Because again, that's part of understanding the way things work right now.
Yeah,
And
and the way
then,
they will work. We have those in actually our community and in the area. So they installed those well before uh, road construction in the area, so before the twinning of the highway went through. And so they
yes,
are continuing to monitor that. So the twinning was done, I think, 4 years ago or 3 years ago. I don't quite remember. Anyways, when that wrapped up, I know our community asked for the testing to extend a number of years to ensure that the water levels were being maintained post blasting, because you don't know if there was a very
yes.
minor fracture anywhere, and we wanted to make sure we were looking after those aquifers.
That's interesting, Jen. Yeah. So it
Hmm.
granted, like the ability to, it was,
Yep.
to continue the monitoring. So that's good. Yeah. And that's where, and again, that goes back to where the monitoring fits in, right?
Hmm.
Looking at during construction and post construction, right? And just to check and make sure, like, obviously your community was concerned about, have those aquifers been damaged, right? Uh, so has that, we don't want to lose that groundwater. We rely on that, right? I'm sure it's used for drinking water. I'd assume, right, in the community, Jen.
Hmm. Because we were thinking about tapping into another one soon as our community grows. So that's the
Yes.
aquifer we were especially concerned about.
Now let's talk a little bit about quality on the quality side. So when we take a groundwater sample, we'll typically analyze it for what you call physical parameters like pH, which is like a
Hmm.
measure, like a measure of acidity, right? Temperature. So these are physical characteristics. And then there'll be chemistry, general chemistry conducted, looking at hardness, turbidity, total suspended solids, total dissolved solids, metals, organic and inorganic compounds, cations, nutrients, and radionuclides. So a full
So what
suite
would
of,
things? I have a question.
sure.
Suspended solids. What's an example?
So for example, like, let's say you had a stream, and so you take a sample of it and you get, I'm just making up numbers here, but let's say you get a suspended solids number of 50, right? And then let's say there's been some erosion upstream, and then you take a sample after that, and all of a sudden
Hmm.
you're getting a total suspended solids result of 300, right? So what that means is there's likely been more erosion or soil that's become broken free, right? Let's say water levels were
Okay.
high and there was flooding, so it's flushed more. There's been more soil loss, more erosion, and that's now, that those soil particles are now sort of hanging in suspension in the water column, in the water.
Okay. So
Yes,
kind of
which
like
can
what we
impact,
see
right?
during spring runoff when the snow melts.
Yes, exactly. Except that
Okay.
happens regularly, right? That's a
Hmm.
characteristic of spring. But if it's happening all the time, then something's wrong, right? And then that impacts the aquatic habitat because the sun is no longer able to penetrate to the degree it could through the water, right?
Hmm.
And so it changes the whole environment for for anything that lives in the water, right? So
Right.
that's that's what you're trying to prevent, right? That's why
Okay.
when
Hmm.
you're doing water crossings and building water crossings and stuff, there's all kinds of erosion and sediment control measures that are undertaken, and that's because you don't want those suspended solids getting in and being released on, or those soil particles getting in and being released on a regular basis, because it'll totally change the aquatic
That's right.
habitat, and which is not a good thing, right? So
And we're trying
um,
not to do that.
yeah, yeah, exactly. We're trying to preserve it as close to the way it was before, right? So
Hmm.
um, that's why, those erosion and sediment control measures, they're really, really important in terms of, especially when you're putting in bridge crossings, because you're doing a lot of in-water work or work that's right beside the water, and so you got to make sure those measures are in place to limit soil loss. Um, let's talk a little bit about surface water field studies.
Okay.
So what we do in that case is we identify the high priority water body crossing sites. So we focus our sampling, our surface water sampling, on the areas where the crossings will occur, right? Because these are the areas that we're most concerned about from the construction activities, because we're going to be doing a lot of building in that area, and any kind of construction, there might be some soil loss. Even if we try to mitigate it, there's still going to be some, even if it's just for a relatively brief period of time. So we try to focus our sampling on those areas. We do it at
Mhm.
different times a year, just like we talked about, Jen, with groundwater, right? To understand how things change season to season. And then the parameters that we test for are the same as with groundwater. Um, to sort of understand the chemical composition, the physical characteristics, biological characteristics of the water. And then we also, wherever we can't always, just because of safety purposes, and sometimes the water gets deep, but we try to get water depth and flow information at the different water bodies to sort of understand, how they work, right? The hydrology of them,
Mhm.
like the behavior of the water course, the depth, the flow rates, the banks, understanding the sort of the geometry of the water courses in different locations, or morphology or geomorphology is another word for it. The sort of structure and function of the water course. So we try to get a handle on that, and that information's used is fed into when we do modeling, for to size culverts and other types of crossings. So there's
Mhm.
lots of work involved in the field that feeds into the models as well. So now, as we near the end here, let's talk a little bit about mitigation methods, because you and I, Jen, have talked
Okay.
about mitigation, not migration,
We
right? But
have
mitigation.
not migration.
And
Yes, that's right.
yeah, so
Oh, we
and
can talk
so
about migration.
we can talk about migration. That's really another topic for another day, really. But you're right. We can still talk about it. Um, so what we
But
do
today we're
here
talking
in
about mitigation.
mitigation, yes, limiting impacts and minimizing impacts, or sometimes
Yes.
eliminating impacts. So there's a number of different methods that could be used. Um, you could identify locations that are a safe distance, for storing equipment and materials that are a safe distance away from water bodies or other sensitive features. You could remove suspended solids from runoff, surface water runoff, when you're grading the road or shaping the road.
Mhm.
Or if you're having to dewater certain areas, meaning remove water that's coming up from the ground in your construction area, then you can make sure that the suspended solids are removed before that water is pumped someplace else, so you're not creating problems in other places. Um, you can use, we talked about this before, erosion and sediment control techniques such as filter bags or silt fences or erosion control
Mhm.
blankets. You can test groundwater and surface water during construction to make sure that the water is still acceptable enough quality, meaning it meets water quality uh, guidelines. So there are guidelines that Ontario has for water quality, so you can chemically test the samples and make sure that they're still meeting those guidelines as well. You can identify sites for either permanent or temporary for extraction pits, like aggregate extraction pits that minimize impacts on groundwater for sure.
Mhm.
Um, you can put supportive infrastructure like lay down areas, storage areas in places that have less impact on surface water or groundwater. You could use the proper size and type of water crossing structure, right? Based on the work that you
Right.
do, the modeling work to size it properly. Um, and again, like we talked about, Jen, considering climate change, when the openings, for example, of culverts are designed, they should be done in such a way so as to keep in mind future changes in climate, potential, more extreme changes in climate, and in order for them to last longer as well. And this is something that's sort of
Like
been
perhaps
happening
a
over the
year
last
with,
few years.
and maybe one year we'll
Sorry, what was that,
have,
Jen?
I said maybe even one year we'll have a crazy amount of snow,
Yes.
more
Yeah.
than what has been happening maybe one year. So we need to accommodate the water drainage for all of that. And that kind of, when we're talking about the construction part and all these mitigation measures, it also makes me think about a little bit about road design. So when we were talking about the road is actually not absolutely flat, right? Because it has to allow
That's right.
for
Yep.
a little bit of runoff. So, the road will be maintained properly and won't be too much affected by potential issues like potholes you can get when the freeze and thaw and weather gets to the road.
That's exactly it, Jen. Like the road has to be continuously shaped, right, to have that sort of
Mm-hmm.
crown, so the water drains off it, and so that those little potholes that might form, they get filled in, and the road gets reshaped. So yeah, it's a constant, and that's where the maintenance comes in, right? Is making sure that
Mm-hmm.
excuse me, that you maintain that shape. The other thing is using rock to protect the inlets and outlets of culverts. You've seen these before, eh, Jen? Like around
Mm-hmm.
the openings, you have the riprap size stone, which is sort of like this big.
I,
Uh,
I love that phrase. It
around,
reminds me of music.
yeah, that's right, riprap. Yeah, it's a funny name, and but it's used quite often, right, to line channels or to prevent soil loss, to prevent erosion, right, and
Mm-hmm.
then just different operations and maintenance techniques for grading the road, like shaping the road and material storage, things like that. There's a lot of different techniques to mitigate impacts. These are just a few of them, like general ones, but when you put together what's called the environmental management plan, which we've talked about before,
Mm-hmm.
these things will get specified in a lot more detail. Right now, we're talking about them in a sort of general way, but they become much more specific depending on different situations, right? And that environmental
That's
management
right.
plan and the enforcement of that plan is through environmental monitors is really, really critical to ensuring that the project doesn't leave any impacts during construction and then of course post construction too, Jen. So um, yeah, lots to think about from today's
Lots of
discussion, eh?
moving pieces. Yeah, and that's why we're
Yes,
doing one thing at a time.
yes, that's right, because otherwise it would definitely be overwhelming, and
It sure
it
can be.
looks like yeah, there's a lot of content. It looks like we've run out of time here, Jen,
Mm-hmm.
so that wraps up what we're talking about today on groundwater and the surface water studies, and we hope this was helpful, and we hope it makes you want to come back next week when we talk about geology, terrain, and soil studies. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on your screen or on our website, northernroadlink.ca. And I'd just like to say, miigwech, make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our website. See you soon.
Aha, miigwech, bamapi.